Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly webinar series that occurs here on our Facebook page every Friday at noon. My name is Brianna. I'm a Sustainable Transportation Vermont intern, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Gregory Rowangould is the new director of UVM Transportation Research Center. He will discuss some of the sustainability challenges facing transportation in Vermont and its many small and rural communities. And then he will discuss how UVM Transportation Research Center's research and outreach programs can help. So I'm going to bring Gregory up now. Hi, Gregory.
Hi. All right. Well, first, I'd just like to thank Brianna for introducing me and Richard Watts for inviting me to come and talk with everyone today and the Center for Research on Vermont. And so, as was mentioned, I'm the new director of the Transportation Research Center here at the University of Vermont. It's a position I started right before the pandemic in January, February timeframe. And so this is a relatively new role that I'm in. And I'm also new to Vermont. So I moved here just about a year ago from New Mexico, where I had been a professor for around 6 or 7 years. And prior to that, I worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council in Los Angeles, where I was an air quality and transportation scientist. So yeah, I'm here, and I'm originally from New England. I grew up mostly in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and I went to college in Maine before moving out to California for graduate school. And so I'm really excited to be back in New England and particularly here in Vermont. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the big challenges to sustainable transportation in Vermont. And I'm still learning about some of them since I'm relatively new to Vermont. Despite living in New England for a large portion of my life, I really haven't spent much time in Vermont. And then I hope there's time to have some discussion, talk a little bit about what we're trying to do here at the TRC and at UVM. So before I move on, though, just a little bit more about myself. I am also in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, where I teach courses in transportation engineering, planning, and policy. My research involves travel behavior, air pollution modeling, greenhouse gas emission modeling of the transportation sector, and modeling and designing regional transportation systems. And I have a background in engineering and economics and policies. And I think so. I have a few slides that we're going to bring up, and it won't be an extensive slideshow, so don't worry about that. And I just want to go over what some of the big sort of challenges, some data to kind of frame what I'm going to talk about. So we can move to the next slide. So just a little bit about the UVM Transportation Research Center. It was established in 2006. And at that time, there was a big federal grant that also helped kick it off. And today, the center has about 12 core faculty and research staff that are full-time working on transportation research and teaching and all that. We have a number of additional affiliated researchers from across campus that work with the TRC staff from time to time on various projects. We have a number of undergraduates, master's students, and PhD students working on research projects with TRC staff and faculty, and there's lots of research opportunities. So anyone out there is looking for an opportunity, you should come talk to us. And we're the home to several additional programs and centers that are partnerships with other universities. So there's the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, which is led by UC Davis, and we are part of that center. There's the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center, which is led by the University of Maine, so we're part of that center. And then we also have the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition in the TRC as well, which conducts outreach on alternative fuels for transportation and other things. So moving on here. So there are, of course, a wide range of challenges to sustainable transportation. And so I've picked out what I think are some of the really big ones and that present unique challenges to a state like Vermont. So the first thing here is climate change. And I was, quite frankly, shocked when I moved to Vermont and first saw this plot. I think, as we all think and know, Vermont's a very progressive state. There is a lot of public support for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, both politically and publicly. On this plot, you can see there are a number of goals, and there are new emission reduction goals as part of the recently passed Global Warming Solution Act. They're not shown on this plot, but despite all that, and this image as a very green and sustainable state, which in many ways it is, they've largely failed to make much progress on greenhouse gas emissions, right? So you can see the historical trend of greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Almost all the targets and goals are relative to 1990 levels, and emissions have only increased since then. And so this is certainly a huge challenge. So can we move to the next slide, please? And if we compare Vermont and greenhouse gas emissions per capita, right? So the average greenhouse gas emissions that a Vermonter produces, that's higher than any other New England state and New York as well. So it's not only that Vermont hasn't made progress, but we're emitting more greenhouse gas emissions per person in Vermont than anywhere else in the region. Next slide. And transportation accounts for basically half of those emissions in Vermont, right? So this is why I'm talking about climate change and transportation. We all know transportation is a large source of greenhouse gas emissions, but in rural states like Vermont, the transportation sector is the overwhelming, the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this is why this is a huge challenge. Next slide. And you can look here. This is a nice table that shows the greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors of the Vermont economy and how they've changed over time since 1990. And there's two things going on that result in transportation emissions being such a big share, is that most sectors have actually reduced emissions over time. And even if transportation emissions had been steady, that would lead to a growing share of transportation being a larger share of overall greenhouse gas emissions. But transportation emissions have been increasing over time as well. So most sectors of the economy have been steady or decreasing, and transportation emissions have been increasing. So this is why I put this as really one of the #1 challenges in Vermont. Next slide. Related to this is automobile dependence. I think it's not much of a surprise that in a state that has a lot of small and rural communities, that a lot of people depend on driving a personal vehicle, a truck, an SUV, a car to get around. The plot on the left of the screen shows vehicle miles traveled per capita, the amount that each person drives on average per year in Vermont, and that it's gone down a little bit over time, and it's been and it was increasing until the pandemic, and it's at a much higher level than the U.S. on average. And the plot on the right shows the little green bars Vermont, and that's the VMT, vehicle miles traveled per capita, compared with all other states. And you can see Vermont's pretty close to the top. And if you look at the states, you can see that states that are more rural, people drive more, which is obvious. And so, next slide, please. And we can also look at this another way and look at the mode share over time. So we often look at the share of trips made by different modes of travel, with carpooling and driving a car by yourself, two different types of modes. You can see that driving a vehicle by yourself to get to work has been increasing over time in Vermont, right? And the other, and carpooling has been declining, and most other ways of getting around, whether it's transit or walking or biking, have been relatively steady. And so automobile dependence is certainly a challenge for addressing those greenhouse gas emissions that we were talking about, but it's also leads to a number of other challenges, right? Cars are expensive to own and operate, and so to the extent that we develop communities and a transportation system, assuming that people are going to get around with a motor vehicle, this can be a large burden, particularly on lower income households, but also for individuals and households that can't drive a car or don't have access to a car for some reason, such as physical disability, age, the ability to obtain a driver's license. And automobile dependence has a wide range of public health impacts, from active travel, being able to walk and bike, whether it's biking to work and being concerned about the volume of traffic on roadways and being able to do that, or just having the space to do this on our streets. There is air pollution. We talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but there are also toxic air pollutants from operating a motor vehicle that raise concerns. There's impacts on water quality with runoff from roads. There are impacts on urban heat. Even though Vermont's not very urban, all this paved surface can contribute to warmer temperatures in the summer and increasing demands for air conditioning and energy use. There's noise. There is the cost of maintaining a large highway system and network of local roads that are designed for motor vehicles, and the ongoing maintenance of those, which has been very difficult to fund adequately. So there are a large number of things that come out of automobile dependence, in addition to the greenhouse gas emission climate change challenges that we started with. Next slide. And the last big thing here is safety. Probably one of the most dangerous things you can do in any given day is to drive a car or be near a roadway with cars on it. This is just a map showing, just 1 year, the location of crashes, vehicle crashes. Fortunately, many of them are not fatal, but this certainly, I think, gives you a sense that driving a motor vehicle is not the safest thing in the world, and neither is being near streets. And so I don't have the up-to-date statistics, but a few years ago when I looked this up for one of the classes I teach, according to CDC, motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for individuals approximately from about the ages of 3 to 33. It varies from year to year. That was before the pandemic. And so for basically young, relatively healthy people, the number one cause of death is getting in a traffic accident or traffic crash. We don't call them accidents. And so safety is a huge concern. And it's a big concern in a rural state that is more automobile dependent. All right, next slide. And this was just in the news yesterday that fatal crashes have been rising in Vermont. So the fatal crash rates have been declining in Vermont year over year for many years, as has been the case in most of the country. And a lot of this comes from better vehicle technology. Vehicles are safer. We've designed roadways to be a bit more safe. But crashes are up. And even though compared to historical level, fatalities are much lower than they used to be, if you look at the map on the right, those are the location of all the fatal crashes in the last 5 years. And you can see it's a large number of fatalities. So this is certainly a large concern. Next slide. So, and this is my last slide. So given this, these challenges: climate change, automobile dependence, and all the things that go along with that, and safety, they're all related, obviously, and they're not challenges unique to Vermont. These are challenges everywhere in the U.S., in almost every country, and they're big and they're complicated. But one thing that we're starting to think about at the TRC is really, what does a sustainable transportation system, and defining sustainable sustainable transportation more than just environmental sustainability, but thinking about the sustainability of rural communities, the economic development, and as well as the natural environment and air quality and all that. What does that look like in Vermont and as many small and rural communities? Right? This is a challenge. This picture, I took this from Google Earth to try to get a view of sort of the diversity of land uses in Vermont. You can see Burlington down in the bottom, and there's some urbanization, but right. We have agricultural areas, we have mountains, we have small towns, we have rural dispersed settlements. There's a huge diversity of types of communities in Vermont and settlement patterns and land uses. And I think this causes a huge challenge. And so the rural nature of the state and its small urban areas and just the mix of everything in between, I think, is a big challenge. There are challenges about urban and rural equity. What the opportunities and alternatives available for transportation in Burlington and maybe in the other maybe compact town center stuff are a lot different than in more dispersed settlements. There are issues with economic development in smaller and rural communities. And overall, I think a big challenge is that what works in larger urban areas and in more urbanized states and bigger cities, the solutions, the opportunities, the methods for even evaluating transportation don't necessarily translate to a smaller state like Vermont with very different land use and a different mix of community types. And I feel much of the transportation field and a lot of the research and scholarship and the data we've translated what we've learned in urban areas and tried to make them work in a rural context or a small community context. I don't want to say rural because a number of our communities do have some urbanized town centers and they're urbanized to different levels. But we don't, so that's sort of been our approach. And I think that might be leading to some of the challenges we see Vermont's having. We have no shortage of goodwill and political support and public support, but we're not achieving our goals. And so what we're hoping to do at the TRC, and we're starting to do with some new research projects, is to learn about how people are traveling in different types of communities, even trying to learn what these communities are. How do we define them in a way that makes sense for understanding travel behavior and how people travel and what the different types of barriers people face to travel currently and what types of barriers exist for changing behavior or the vehicles people drive or where people live or want to live. We just don't have great data on that, and I think we all have ideas about what's going on in different communities, but that's where we want to start, is collecting new data specific to these different rural contexts, to Vermont. And then we want to think about, with this data, what can we do with it? What can we evaluate our existing policies and how well are they likely to work or not? Are there things we can do to make them more effective? Can we think of new policies and strategies that aren't borrowed from urban regions, but are something we build from the ground up in that to address the context here? And then we need to build, right? We need to conduct outreach. We need to build up coalitions, communicate with our leaders, decision makers, and the public, and hopefully move things forward. And I know that there are lots of community groups and existing coalitions and networks. So I'm really interested in getting to learn more about what people are already doing and how new data and new research that we're hoping to do here at the TRC can support the efforts that are going on around the state. So with that, that is, that's all my prepared remarks, I guess, or talk. It was kind of a real quick overview, and I was hoping there'd be some opportunity to talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation. So we have a few questions already, so I'm just going to get those started. So the first one is from Jack Hansen, who is the Sustainable Transportation Vermont's internship coordinator. And Jack asks, how big of a role do you think e-bikes will play in Vermont's transportation system as we shift towards a more sustainable system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So currently, the bicycle mode share in Vermont it's small. It's maybe around % or less. Of course, there's not really great data on it, but we know e-bikes can be a real game changer. I ride e-bike to school, to work. And we actually have a study going on right now about how people are using e-bikes in Chittenden County and how that's changing how people travel. We're thinking about what type of infrastructure is required to support e-bikes. And we're also looking at conflicts between regular bikes and e-bikes and traffic. So I think there's certainly a lot of potential there. We're seeing a large increase in e-bike use. And it's, you can look at bicycling rates in other parts of the world and even other parts of this country. I have my PhD from UC Davis. There's about 30% bicycle mode share there compared to, the 1% in Vermont, and maybe it's a few percent in Burlington. And if you go and look at cities with really high bicycle mode shares like that, you see extensive infrastructure, right? Protected bicycle lanes, totally separated bicycle path networks, not 3-foot bicycle lanes, 15-foot bicycle lanes. And that's what it really takes to achieve a high rate of bicycling. It's snowy here, it's hilly here. It was 30 degrees out this morning. So it might be more challenging than in Davis, California, where it's flat and warm. But there are plenty of cold and snowy places where people bike a lot too. So it certainly could play an important role, but it will take a big change in the way we do things.
Awesome. And staying on the topic of electric, Jacob Weinstein, who's an intern at STVT, asks, do you think that the state of Vermont's electric vehicle goals are a sustainable and healthy way to transform our transportation system?
I think that electric vehicles are going to be a very important part of achieving our climate change goals and other sustainability goals. I've spent a long time studying air pollution, toxic air toxics, and modeling exposure to them and the negative health impacts of emissions from motor vehicles. And then when we think about greenhouse gas emissions as well, electric vehicles can be a huge part of addressing these challenges. Of course, it depends on the sustainability of the electric power grid itself. And in Vermont, we get a large portion of our electricity is renewable. A lot of it's hydro. In Burlington, there's biomass and wind as well. And those sources, although they might be carbon neutral, obviously have there are a number of other environmental challenges with them. So it's not as if they are free or without any cost. And so with that, it is important not to just focus on just one solution. I don't think electric vehicles are going to solve all our sustainable transportation problems. We still have the traffic safety issues. We still have active travel issues. We still have issues with auto dependency and the cost of these vehicles and the cost of infrastructure for them to travel on. And there's the issue of who will have access to electric vehicles, right? They're expensive. And even if they were not more expensive than a new car, a lot of people can't even afford a new car. So there are a lot of challenges to EVs, but I think they are definitely going to be an important part of increasing the sustainability of the transportation system.
And I think you kind of just addressed this question, but maybe you could just talk about it a little bit more. Catherine Farmer, who's another intern, asked, do you think there's one sustainable transportation switch that would be most effective in reducing emissions, like switching to all EVs or greater emphasis on public transportation?
I don't. I think that it is prudent to tackle this from all sides. I think it's going to require doing a lot of things, and for a couple of reasons. One is some things inevitably just aren't going to work out the way we hope or think they will, and so putting all our eggs in one basket is probably not a great strategy. But there are multiple impacts of the way we currently travel, and multiple communities and types of people that are impacted in different ways. And so just thinking about EVs, well, okay, EVs can address our air toxics problem, our air quality problems. They can address, hopefully, our concerns about greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't address traffic safety. And it doesn't address the perpetual problem with trying to fund transportation infrastructure and keep bridges from falling down. Public transit, right, can help address the cost of travel, can it's helpful in reducing emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. It can free up some road space, so there's efficiencies there. But in such a rural state like Vermont, obviously, at least what we traditionally think of as transit isn't going to work everywhere or work that well or efficiently. There's even new pilots in microtransit in Montpelier and other innovative things we can do. And, bicycling, like I said, I love biking. I am a bike fanatic, but I know not everyone wants to hop on a bike and go through the snow and the rain or whatever. So it's about providing the opportunity for people to make more efficient decisions in a way that's going to work for them. It's about options. Can we make a better transit system that makes that an option that's realistic and more attractive to more people? Can we build infrastructure that may make bicycling more realistic and enjoyable for people who currently don't? And let's face it, we're still going to drive. I own a car. I love taking a road trip as much as anyone else probably. How do we improve the efficiency and the safety of that as well? So I think we need to look at this from all sides. And I think it's also important, we're talking about infrastructure and things. We have to think about policies around land use. And I'm not advocating that everyone move to a city. People move to Vermont probably to escape the city. We should recognize that. We think about economic policies, right? There's different ideas on carbon taxes and cap and trade and those things, and how those impact the diverse communities we have in Vermont, and issues of equity across income levels and rural and urban are really complex issues that need to be thought about too. But I think some of those policies will also be important to addressing transportation sustainability.
And Keith Epstein asks, what does the term sustainable transportation mean at the TRC?
Right, that's a good question. So, I mean, I think I've been trying to define that throughout this talk, and I'll sort of reiterate back to, I think I mentioned a little bit ago. When I think of sustainable transportation, it's not just environmental sustainability. That's a big part of it, but we're talking about the economic sustainability of different communities, right? And just the general overall well-being of Vermonters and beyond, and being able to sustain that, right? Can we? I think it's part of, and so that's sustainability overall. Obviously, transportation has so many impacts, both positive and negative, and it's can we reinforce the important things that transportation achieves for us, right? The ability to access the things we need and want, and can we mitigate and reduce the burdens that it causes, both financially, socially, to our health, and to the environment.
And thank you. And our last question is from Jess Davidson, who is an STBT intern. And she asks, based off the research you've conducted in both, what is the most surprising difference between transportation needs and challenges for people in Los Angeles versus Burlington?
Well, we're just getting started here. Well, I'm just getting started here in Vermont. There's been, obviously, the center's been around for a long time, and lots of research has been done, and I don't even know all the work that's been done here. But there are, I mean, the difference from my work in California is thinking about, and this is where I've come to this idea I'm trying to put out there, this at least hypothesis that much of my own education so I've been studying transportation for, I don't know, 20 years maybe at this point, between, a master's and a PhD focusing on transportation, and then working at an RDC and being a college professor. So most of everything in the literature that I was taught in various classes I've taken and research that I've done myself is about urban areas. I mean, we talk about sprawl and stuff. Sprawl is defined as like the stuff around an urban area. And so in Los Angeles, it's a massive urbanized area, and we're talking about the major challenges in the urban area, right? Congestion. I mean, this is just gridlock in LA. I didn't even ride my bike in LA. I lived somewhere that was quite dense, and I just walked around. But the bus was so slow to get from I lived and worked out in Santa Monica to downtown Los Angeles. You could walk faster than the bus, and most people didn't drive anywhere. When we first moved to Santa Monica, we tried to drive out to the Sierra Nevadas, go camping for some weekend. We thought we'd beat the traffic and leave early, and we left like around 2 p.m. or something. I don't think we got out at Los Angeles until 10 o'clock at night. So congestion and gridlock and our major issues. Air pollution is a huge problem. All that traffic all in one place creates very poor air quality, and there are major issues, environmental justice and equity issues. Lower income communities of color are generally located on these transportation corridors and bear the brunt of these problems. And so, thinking to Vermont, there are some similar issues, but we're not facing massive congestion issues, and our air quality is generally good. There is, of course, it's not great if you're living right next to a busy highway, but we're not talking about the air quality problems that you would see in a major urban area. And while I'm sure there's congestion here and there for certain times of the day, this is not the level you would see in Boston or New York or LA. And so our challenges are different. It's about covering large distances. It's a dispersed population, and it's not urban sprawl. These are small communities, rural communities. They've always been small and rural. It's part of what makes Vermont, Vermont. And so that's a big difference. In Los Angeles, we're trying to create more dense infill development. I don't think that, that doesn't just translate to what we're doing in Vermont, where sure, there's parallels in Burlington and other city centers, but what do we do elsewhere? I mean, and I don't have the answer to that, and that's what we're trying to figure out.
Well, thank you so much for being here and talking with us. This has been great. Is there anything else you'd like to say before?
That's it. Just, once again, to say thanks for having me come on here and talk. And I look forward to, learning more about what different people are doing in this space, and hopefully making some progress.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you next Friday at noon again. And yeah, I hope everyone has a really good weekend.
Okay.